The United States History by Joseph Jarrell, Chapter 6, Independence, 1770 to 1783. The Revolution was effected before the war commenced. John Adams, founding father and future president, reflected years afterward. The Revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people. This radical change in the principles, opinions, sentiments, and affections of the people was the real American Revolution. This revolution in the heart was in many ways an evolution that began at Jamestown and Plymouth more than a century earlier. Escalating events, however, gradually moved the revolution from the heart to open conflict. The question for many Americans became not whether they would submit to taxes, but whether they would submit to tyranny. One interview with an old veteran Minuteman, Levi Preston, conducted more than 50 years after he fought the British, cuts to the crucial issue behind the war. The interviewer asked Preston to describe the British oppressions that led to independence. The ancient warrior replied, "Oppressions? I didn't feel them." What were what? Were you not oppressed by the Stamp Act? I never saw one of those stamps. I am certain I never paid a penny for one of them. Well, then what about the tea tax? Tea tax? I never drank a drop of that stuff. The boys threw it all overboard. Then I suppose you had to be reading Harrington or Sidney and Locke about the eternal principles of liberty. Never heard of 'em, the old man answered. We read only the Bible, the Catechism, Watt's Psalms and Hymns, and the Almanac. The puzzled questioner demanded, Well, then, what was the matter, and what did you mean in going to the fight? Young man, what we meant in going for those redcoats was this. We always had governed ourselves, and we always meant to. They didn't mean we should. Number 1. The Eve of War. After the Boston Massacre, tensions relaxed in the colonies. The calm, however, was merely the eye of the storm. In June of 1772, an armed British customs ship, the Giuseppe, ran aground near Providence, Rhode Island. The ship's captain, who had previously searched ships without a warrant, had sent his crew ashore to seize food without paying for it. It was not welcomed in Rhode Island. On the night of June 9th, local citizens boarded the Giuseppe, captured and removed the crew, and burned the ship. This attack on one of His Majesty's ships promoted the British to send a commission to investigate and make arrests. In the past, such matters had been handled by colonial courts. At the same time, the Massachusetts governor announced that his salary would now come from the king, not the colony. No longer would the legislature be able to limit the governor or other royal officials by using the power of the purse. More and more, the colonists came to believe that their rights were being stripped away. Another development in 1772 furthered this belief. In November, the Boston town meeting authorized the formation of a committee of correspondence. Under the guidance of Samuel Adams, the committee provided information on British threats to liberty to other areas of the colony. The Boston Committee also successfully encouraged the formation of a network of committees of correspondence. Within 3 months, 80 new committees were formed in Massachusetts alone. In March 1773, the Virginia legislature voted to establish a permanent committee of correspondence, and other colonies quickly followed. The committees provided not only information but also a model of intercolonial cooperation that would be an important step towards a united political and military response to British actions. The Boston Tea Party. The Tea Act. The East India Company had been one of the most profitable businesses in Britain, but the company was facing a crisis. Its warehouses were stuffed with 17 million pounds of tea. The company, verging on bankruptcy, turned to its powerful friends for help. At the urge of the Prime Minister, Lord North, Parliament passed the Tea Act of 1773, which basically granted the East India Company a monopoly on the shipment and sales of English tea in America. The British tea was still cheaper to buy than the smuggled Dutch tea. However, colonists were enraged. If Parliament could grant a monopoly on tea, what's next? In port cities from Boston to Charleston, opposition to the tea shipment was intense. The New York and Philadelphia, for example, tea agents resigned, and sea captains returned their cargoes home to England for fear of their lives and property. Tea, like the hated Stamp Act nearly a decade earlier, became a symbol of tyranny. Coffee replaced the British beverage on Patriot tables. Boston Harbor, a tea pot tonight. When tea arrived in Boston Harbor, a board the Dartmouth on November 28, 1773, patriots made every effort to have it returned to England. The governor refused to allow the ship's return, and the confrontation became a stalemate. The patriots were determined that the tea would not be unloaded in Boston. The governor was determined that it would be. On the evening of December 16, 1773, thousands gathered at the Boston town meeting in the Old South Church, not far from the waterfront. Shortly afterwards, to shouts of Boston Harbor, a tea pot tonight, approximately 150 men and boys crudely disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians on board of the Dartmouth and two other newly arrived tea ships. In the Boston Tea Party, the group dumped 342 large cases of tea into the harbor in under 3 hours. To clarify the purpose of their protest, the raiders took great care to avoid damaging anything except the tea. Even a broken padlock was unanimously replaced the next day. Only one man was caught stealing tea, and he was promptly kicked off the ship. When the ships had been emptied of tea, the participants cleaned them and released their crews. The patriots then lined up at attention on deck, emptied any loose tea from their boots, swept it into the harbor, and marched away singing, "Rally, Mohawks! Bringing out our axes, and tell King George we'll pay no taxes on his foreign tea." Even pro-British colonists or loyalists admitted that the Tea Party had been conducted as correctly as a crime could be. Across the Atlantic, however, the incident was not regarded lightly. A law had been disregarded and property had been destroyed. King George III instructed Lord North that it was time for strong measures against the colonies. The colonies must either submit or triumph, the king declared. On this, at least, the patriots and the king were in agreement. The Intolerable Acts. The Boston Tea Party spurred the British government to action against Massachusetts in 1774. Parliament passed 4 acts known collectively as the Coercive Acts, intended to punish the troublesome colony. The first act closed the harbor effective June 1, 1774, until the cost of the destroyed tea was repaid. The second act revoked the Massachusetts colonial charter. Now officials would be appointed by the royal governor rather than elected, and town meetings were allowed only with the governor's approval. The third act dictated that British officials accused of committing crimes be tried not in Massachusetts but in another colony or in England. In a new quartering act, the fourth act required the housing and feeding of British soldiers in private homes, with the arrival of the military governor, General Thomas Gage, to replace the existing governor. Bostonians knew that their city was under military occupation. If colonial submission was the purpose behind the Coercive Acts, they were clearly a failure. In America, these measures, called the Intolerable Acts by patriots who refused to be coerced, hardened opposition and created an unprecedented sense of unity among the colonies. In addition, Parliament passed the Quebec Act, which was directed at British Canada, not the 13 colonies. The timing, however, could not have been worse. The Quebec Act set up a rigid political system, made Roman Catholicism the official religion of Quebec, and extended the territorial boundaries of Quebec southward to the Ohio River. The possibility of Catholicism rising in the West with the approval of Parliament enraged many American Protestants, who had fled Catholic persecution in Europe. They also feared that the act might set a precedent for Parliament to establish Anglicanism as the state religion throughout the colonies. The Quebec Act encouraged many Christians to join the growing chorus of dissent out of fear of centralized religious authority. First Continental Congress, 1774. Sympathy for beleaguered Boston spread throughout the colonies. In the House of Burgess in Williamsburg, a 31-year-old Virginian named Thomas Jefferson called for a day of fasting and prayer as a show of support for Boston patriots. The royal governor, upon hearing of the resolution, dissolved the House. Unperturbed, the legislators simply reconvened in a nearby tavern, where they adopted a resolution calling for the meeting of the Continental Congress. Similar calls came from other colonies. The Massachusetts House of Representatives called for the colonial committees of the correspondence to meet in Philadelphia in September. On September 5th, a representative from all the colonies except Georgia gathered in Philadelphia's Carpenter's Hall for the First Continental Congress. Far from being a gathering of radicals, the 55 delegates had been elected by their colonial assemblies or by providential governance Congress, and included some of the most distinguished men in America, including George Washington, Patrick Henry of Virginia, as well as Samuel Adams of Massachusetts. The changing times required new thinking, and the delegates showed themselves equal to the task. The geographic historical features that divided the colonies had to give way to united thinking. Patrick Henry declared, "The distinctions between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, and New Yorkers, New Englanders, are no more. I'm not a Virginian, but an American." A spirit of cooperation existed among the delegates. When one member proposed that the sessions open with prayer, the idea was at first opposed on the grounds of Congregationalists, Presbyterians, Quakers, Anglicans, Mennonites, all represented among the delegates, could not possibly worship together. Samuel Adams, who was a young man, had sat under the preaching of George Whitefield. He favored the prayer proposal and declared that his faith did not prevent him from hearing anyone pray as long as the man was devout in his religious beliefs and a patriot. The other delegates conceded the point, and the next day an Anglican pastor arrived. During the night, word reached the city that General Gage's troops had opened fire on civilians in Boston. In light of the tragedy in Boston, the minister read Psalm 35, 1 and 2, "Plead my cause, O Lord, with them that strive with me, fight against them and fight against me. Take hold of the shield and buckler, and stand up for mine help." Then he prayed powerfully for 10 minutes for the people of Boston. When he had finished, the assembly was visibly moved and many delegates wept openly. Although the report of Boston casualties proved to be false, Gage had confiscated a stock of Patriot gunpowder, but there were no deaths. The delegates proceeded with business. They adopted a Declaration of American Rights that stated the colonies must be self-governing in nearly every respect. Although they maintained their allegiance to the king, they asserted that his actions had to be consistent with American rights. As self-governing states, the colonies had the right to raise militias to defend themselves. After 7 weeks of work, the delegates agreed to reconvene in Congress in May of 1775. None of them could foresee that by then the course of events would take a decidedly bloody turn. Shot heard around the world. When the delegates returned to their homes, they set about putting their words into actions. In October of 1774, Massachusetts had already established a provincial congress that was elected by the people. This assembly, in addition to the usual legislative functions, prepared Massachusetts for the conflict that loomed over Boston. They authorized the organizing, drilling, and supplying of patriot militia. Special units of militiamen called Minutemen formed a quick first line of defense in case the British invaded the countryside. Throughout the colonies, the patriots gathered their forces militarily and politically. As a gathering of the Virginian Convention in late March 1775, the delegates discussed the issue of organizing volunteer militias. Patrick Henry rose to address his fellow legislators with powerful words that would soon be confirmed with blood. As noted in the last chapter, he said, "Gentlemen may cry peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war has actually begun. The next gale that sweeps the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brothers are already in the field. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." In April 1775, General Gage decided to suppress the growing militia strength in the Massachusetts countryside. Based on spy reports, Gage learned that a large stock of Patriot ammunition, and other military supplies was stored in Concord, a town 16 miles west of Boston. In what he hoped would be a quiet show of force, he ordered 700 soldiers to seize the stockpile. On the night of April 18, 1775, the British quietly rowed across the bay to Cambridge and assembled for the march to Concord. Along the way, they planned to stop in Lexington to arrest 2 Patriot leaders, John Hancock and Samuel Adams. When Patriots learned of the plan, they sent Paul Revere, who had made the Boston Massacre engraving, and William Dawes to warn colonists. These 2 men, following separate routes, made it to Lexington. A third man, Dr. Samuel Prescott, joined them as they rode to Concord. Each was stopped by the British, but Prescott managed to reach Concord. About 70 Lexington Minutemen were waiting on the village green when the British arrived on the morning of April 19th. Just as the sun was breaking through the chill morning mist, Major John Pitcairn, commanding the British advance, stopped the line thin of Patriot militia. Pitcairn ordered his troops to hold their fire and advanced as he galloped forward. Shouting to the Americans to disarm and disband, the Minutemen commander, Captain John Parker, had ordered them not to open fire either, only to stand in a show of defiance to the king's troops. Having accomplished this, the militia began to disperse. At that point, a shot rang out. Who pulled the trigger has never been determined. But the British regulars then unleashed 2 volleys on a scattered band of soldier farmers, killing 8 and wounding 10. Most of them were shot in the back. Pitcairn, angered that his men had disobeyed orders, rebuked his troops. Only one of his men had been wounded in the skirmish. The British then proceeded to Concord. Alerted to the British advance, hundreds of Minutemen converged on the outskirts of Concord. Uncontested, the British entered the town in search of munitions. Most munitions had been removed, but the British burned items they found. The patriots, seeing smoke rising from the village, assumed the British were torching their homes. As a result, a number of Americans advanced on the British at the North Bridge that led to Concord. Fatal shots were exchanged, and the British were pushed back. Years later, our author Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote The Skirmish at Concord Bridge. By the rude bridge, the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled. Here once the embattled farmer stood, and fired the shot heard round the world. For the king's men, the march back to Boston was a nightmare, as patriots fired from the cover of stone walls, trees, and barns. Although most of the Minutemen had never had formal military training, they were experienced wild game hunters, so they found the bright red uniforms of the British easy targets. Although many patriots lost their lives in the Battle of Lexington and Concord, the Americans had clearly won the day. 49 Americans had been killed and about 40 more wounded, but the British regulars had been hurt badly by farmers. Not only were 73 British soldiers killed, 174 wounded, but Patriot forces now had them bottled up in Boston. The war had begun. Number 2, declaring independence. Divided loyalties. The undeclared war that had erupted deeply divided the colonies. Many colonists answered the call to arms as patriots, fighting for the cause of independence. Others, however, were Loyalists or Tories, named after the political parliament that supported the king. Because they continued to support the king, the division cut across regions and social classes. It tore communities and even families apart, pitting father against son, such as Benjamin Franklin and his son William, and brother against brother. In some areas, such as South Carolina, the war for independence was fought almost entirely between American patriots and American loyalists. It is impossible to know how many Americans supported the king during the Revolution, but they were numerous. At least 100,000 loyalists left America by the end of the war. Some historians believe that the loyalists comprised about 20% of the population. Others estimated that allegiances were divided equally among the colonists, 1/3 loyalists, 1/3 patriots, and 1/3 apathetic or uncommitted to either side. Sympathy for the patriots' cause was not confined to America. When the final war came, the British were also divided over waging war against their colonial cousins. Partly because of such attitudes, King George III was forced to find German mercenaries, professional soldiers who were paid to fight, to fill the ranks of the British forces in America. These mercenaries were called Hessians, because most were from the German province of Hesse-Kassel. In addition, some of the most eloquent voices in the British Parliament were raised in opposition to the king's hard-line policies against the 13 colonies. William Pitt, Edmund Burke, and Charles James Fox repeatedly warned their colleagues and king of the hazards of ignoring American rights. Their published speeches so excited the Sons of Liberty with words such as those Pitt delivered in 1777. "If I were an American, as I am an Englishman, while a foreign troop was landed in my country, I never would lay down my arms. Never, never, never." Second Continental Congress. When the delegates gathered in Philadelphia on May 10th of 1775 for the Second Continental Congress, they found themselves in an awkward situation. War in the Massachusetts countryside had erupted 3 weeks earlier, and thousands of New England militia had the British Army pinned down in Boston. In addition, on the day of the opening session, the British held Fort Ticonderoga in New York fell to Patriot forces known as the Green Mountain Boys, under the leadership of Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold. The original purpose of the Continental Congress was not to make laws and supply armies, but to debate and deliver cooperative resolution concerning British colonial policies. Now, however, necessity thrust the matter of governing upon the soldiers of the Assembly. General Washington. The Assembly's first priority was dealing with the military situation around Boston. The delegates appointed one of their own as commander-in-chief. George Washington had arrived in Philadelphia in uniform to offer his service, in command of Virginia's militia forces. Now he was being asked to take charge of the Continental Army, a shabby collection of farmers, shopkeepers facing the best trained, best equipped army in the world. Washington was a natural choice for commander-in-chief. His appointment proved to be one of the best decisions of the Second Continental Congress. As a Southerner, a 43-year-old Virginian would help link the Patriot cause in New England with the rest of the country. As commander of the Virginia forces during the French and Indian War, Washington had emerged from the conflict as a local hero. Though with a war record not unmixed with failure, his greatest strength, however, was not his resume, but his commanding presence, coolness under fire, and keen ability to lead and inspire, all essential to the seemingly impossible task to which the Continental Congress had unanimously elected him. The Siege of Boston. As Washington traveled from Philadelphia to Cambridge, just outside of Boston, to take charge of the army, word came of a major battle near Bunker Hill on the Charleston Peninsula north of Boston. On June 16, 1775, Patriot forces had hastily built fortifications there. The British commander, Thomas Gage, with contempt for the soldier farmers opposing him, ordered a frontal assault on the entrenched Patriots the next day. In an attempt to conserve their limited ammunition, Patriot leader William Prescott reportedly ordered the troops, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." When the British charge failed, the commander ordered a second assault. When that one failed, he ordered a third. The Patriots, having used all of their ammunition, were then forced to retreat. The British won, but the victory was costly. They suffered more than 1,000 casualties among the 2,000 soldiers sent up the slope of Breed's Hill, located near Bunker Hill, where most of the fighting took place. By contrast, of the 1,500 soldiers in the Continental Army, 115 were killed and 300 wounded or captured. Most American casualties came after the colonies had used all their ammunition. Though the British won the engagement, inaccurately named the Battle of Bunker Hill, the encounter showed that the colonial militia could stand up to the British army. When Washington arrived to take the command of the army, the siege of Boston had returned to an uneasy standoff. He decided to break the deadlock. In December, he ordered Colonel Henry Knox to go to Fort Ticonderoga and receive the captured British cannons. Knox, overweight and good-natured, seemed an unlikely choice for the task. His knowledge of artillery had come entirely from books he had read at the Boston bookstore. Nonetheless, Knox was a man who got things done, even colossal things. He and his men used ox, sleds, and rafts to transport 59 pieces of heavy artillery on a wintry mountainside 300-mile trek. When Knox's cannons arrived in late January 1776, Washington put them to good use. On the evening of March 4th, he fortified Dorchester Heights, overlooking Boston and its harbor. When the British awoke on March 5th, they found themselves in an indefensible position and soon were forced to evacuate Boston. The Colonel Knox, the day had a double significance. On March 5th, 1770, he had stood at the front of the crowd in a snowy Boston square when a volley of British bullets claimed its first victims. Now exactly 6 years after the Boston Massacre, the British found themselves on the muzzle end of Knox's heavy guns. The British commander decided his soldiers should withdraw from Boston. He warned the Americans that if they did not allow him to leave peacefully, he would destroy the city. Washington wisely agreed to let the British withdraw. Common sense. Even after sending Washington to Boston to take command of the army, delegates of the Second Continental Congress still hoped to reconcile with Great Britain without sacrificing American rights. On July 5, 1775, the delegates adopted the Olive Branch Petition. An olive branch is a symbol of peaceful intentions, while pledged loyalty to the king and requested his intervention in curbing Parliament's abusive exercise of power. The next day, the Continental Congress issued a declaration of the causes of taking up arms, in which they stated that British actions had left the American people with only two choices: unconditional submission to the tyranny of irritated ministers, or resistance by force. They had chosen to fight. Yet they emphasized that their purpose was to gain recognition of American rights, not to pursue any ambitions designed to separating the Great Britain and establishing independent states. The Olive Branch petition was an attempt to settle matters peacefully, but King George III refused to read it. Instead, he issued a proclamation of rebellion and instructed his Boston army to treat the Americans as open and avowed enemies. Parliament sent 25,000 more troops to suppress the American cause, authorized by hiring of thousands of Hessian mercenaries, and ordered the confiscation of all American exports. For the Patriots, the last ties of allegiance to the crown were snapping. Public opinion was greatly influenced by the 1776 publication of a pamphlet called Common Sense. Its author, Thomas Paine, was an Englishman who had lived in America for a little more than a year. Yet he put patriot thinking into words that fired their will. He described monarchy as a foolish form of government whose path through history was strewn with human wreckage. Paine concluded that the blood of the slain, the weeping voice of nature cries, "'Tis time to part." Sales of Common Sense quickly reached 500,000 copies. George Washington wrote in April 1776, "I find that Common Sense is working a powerful change there in the minds of many men." Later in 1776, Paine wrote the first in the series of 16 papers entitled The American Crisis. In these he continued to argue the patriot cause. Despite his support for the cause of independence, Paine opposed Christianity and advocated an unrestrained form of democracy that John Adams thought dangerous. Free and independent states. During the spring and summer of 1776, one colony after another changed its constitution to a republican form of government. On June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia presented a resolution to the Second Continental Congress calling for complete independence from Britain. The United Colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. Such a final, potential fatal resolution required serious consideration, and debate continued throughout June. The meantime, a committee of 5 men, John Adams of Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, Robert Livingstone of New York, and Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, were appointed to draw up a declaration in support of Lee's resolution. Most of the work on the draft, however, was shouldered by the brilliant and eloquent Jefferson. On July 2nd, the Congress approved the independence resolution. 2 days later, July 4, 1776, Congress approved the final draft of the Declaration of Independence. It not only listed the grievances that Americans had against the king, but also stated universal principles that would shape the character and direction of the emerging nation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. 56 delegates from 13 colonies inscribed their names on this document. Their signing was an act of bravery unsurpassed on the battlefield. Each man knew the British government would view this document as treason. If the cause failed, he was signing his death warrant and could face execution. Yet these courageous men found the cause worth the risk. They sealed their commitment with ink, and were no less willing to seal it with their blood. As Jefferson's closing words of the document state, "We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." Number 3. Early campaigns. Disaster in New York. When the British Army evacuated Boston in March 1776, Washington's temporary relief was mixed with apprehension. Where would the British go next? A few months later, when the British turned their attention to New York City, Washington marched this army to that city and began its defense. New York was not really defensible, however. The Americans had no navy, and the city was bordered by the East and the Hudson rivers and could be entered by a large harbor. The British fleet could land troops at numerous points on the river and march against the American forces. Although it would have been militarily wise to abandon the city, it would have been politically disastrous. Washington and Congress both knew that the Americans could not simply give up one of their most important cities without a fight. The American people, still divided about the war, would see such an act as a sign of weakness and cowardice. Washington therefore prepared for the worst when General William Howe, General Thomas Gage's replacement, landed his forces on Staten Island in July of 1776. From the summer of 1776 to late fall, the British gave the Americans a painful lesson in warfare. On Long Island, Manhattan Island, and mainland, the British won a series of easy victories. Washington's inexperience as a commanding general, the inexperience of the American troops, and the superiority of the British Navy combined to contribute to the defeat of American forces. During one typical skirmish, Washington watched in disgust as some of his soldiers abandoned their positions and ran from the British without firing a shot. The general hurled his hat to the ground in frustration and exclaimed, "Are these the men with whom I am to defend America?" A few bright spots relieved the gloom of the Continental Army. After a disastrous defeat in the Battle of Long Island, August 27, 1776, Washington conducted a brilliant night retreat across the East River. Although retreats would not win the war, they helped save the army from destruction. By November, New York was in British hands, and the Continental Army was in New Jersey. Trenton and Princeton. Trenton, the onset of winter in late 1776, found the Continental Army in great despair. They had been driven from New York, the enlistments of many of the troops would expire at the end of the year, and most of them appeared unwilling to re-enlist in a losing cause. Faced with this disheartening situation, Washington decided on a move as dangerous as it was daring. He would attack. Washington's forces were on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River. In Trenton, on the New Jersey side, lay a force of approximately 1,500 Hessians. On Christmas night, 1776, Washington led some 2,400 men across the river during a howling storm. Snow, freezing rain pelted them as they marched to Trenton through the darkness. At least 2 men froze to death during the march. The abominable weather gave the Americans some advantages, however. The storm hid their movements from the Hessian forces. Furthermore, the Hessians were comfortably sleeping off their Christmas merrymaking. They never expected that anyone would attack in such weather. As dawn neared, Washington attacked Trenton. He caught the astonished Hessians completely unprepared, and after a brief, confused resistance, they surrendered. Nearly 1,000 Hessians were killed or captured. Washington did not lose a single man in the actual fighting. Princeton. Flushed with unaccustomed success, Washington followed the brilliant stroke of Trenton with an equally daring move. About a week after Trenton's victory, he left a small group of American soldiers to keep the campfires burning and to make noise. Meanwhile, the remainder of his army slipped away and attacked British troops at Princeton. The attack on Princeton of July 3, 1777, did not begin well. The Americans, although more numerous than the British, were disorganized. As the small but disciplined British force advanced, Washington and his officers rode into the confused American lines to restore order. General Washington himself rode in front of his line and directed the attack. To the horror of his aides, Washington stayed between the 2 opposing lines and ordered the Americans to fire. One aide covered his own face with his hat, fully expecting to see his commander soon laying dead on the ground. But when the smoke cleared, Washington was unharmed, and the shattered British forces ran. Trenton and Princeton were minor affairs militarily, more like raids than battles. But their effect on American morale was dramatic. After early disasters, any victory would have been welcome. Such overwhelming victories only made the triumph sweeter. There was a visible result as well. Many of the soldiers whose enlistments had expired rejoined the army. The Americans had an army and hope with which to continue the fight. Fight for Philadelphia. The British launched a plan in 1777 that had potential to win the war. They planned a 3-pronged assault on New York. A British force in Canada under General John Burgoyne would move south down Lake Champlain and through the wilderness and upstate New York, while General Howe would send a force north from New York City up the Hudson River to the city of Albany. Meanwhile, a 3rd British force was to take a different route from Montreal to Albany. With these moves, the British would isolate New England from the other colonies. Fortunately for the Americans, Howe did not cooperate with the plan. Instead, he moved against the American capital, Philadelphia. Howe's action proved embarrassing to the United States initially, but in the long run it resulted in the American victory. Instead of marching across New Jersey to Philadelphia, the British used their fleet to sail up the Chesapeake Bay and land in Maryland, some 50 miles from the American capital. As Howe marched from Maryland through northern Delaware and into Pennsylvania, Washington placed the Continental Army behind Brandywine Creek, south of Philadelphia, to await the enemy. At the Battle of Brandywine, September 11, 1777, Howe outmaneuvered Washington. The Continental Army retreated. The British entered Philadelphia unopposed on September 26th. On October 4th, Washington made an attempt to recapture the city by attacking the British forces stationed at Germantown, north of Philadelphia. The attack failed, and the American capital remained in enemy hands. A turning point, Saratoga. While Howe was preparing to blow his blow against Philadelphia, General Burgoyne was marching down Lake Champlain in impressive order. He easily seized Fort Ticonderoga. At this point, however, the British plan for a three-pronged attack began to break down. Howe's decision to attack Philadelphia meant that only a small force would even attempt to move up the Hudson River. The third British force that was marching toward Albany to help Burgoyne was pushed back by an American force. Following these indirect setbacks came several defeats inflicted directly on Burgoyne's forces. Then, in two separate battles south of Saratoga, New York, September 19th and October 7th, 1777, the Americans dealt heavy blows to the British. The American commander, General Horatio Gates, received much of the glory for these victories, but the real credit belonged to Gates' subordinates, General Benedict Arnold and Colonel Daniel Morgan. The British attempts to retreat to Canada, however, the Americans, who were more experienced woodsmen, overtook and surrounded them near Saratoga. On October 17th, Burgoyne surrendered to Gates. The Battle of Saratoga was a major turning point of the war. First, an entire British invasion force of more than 6,000 men had been killed or captured. Second, France entered the war. France was eager to see Americans win their independence because it would weaken France's rival, Great Britain. The French, having provided war material and loans to America, after the surprising American victory at Saratoga, France officially recognized the United States as a separate nation and then entered the war against its old enemy, the British. America now had a powerful ally in its struggle for independence. A winter of discontent and hope, Valley Forge. Word of the French alliance did not reach America until the spring of 1778. Meanwhile, Washington and his army went through perhaps the darkest period of the war. With the British controlling the former capital, Philadelphia, the American army made its headquarters for the winter of 1777 and 78, some 25 miles away at Valley Forge. The army had to build a camp there. A city of wooden barracks and huts soon sprouted in Valley Forge. But the soldiers were hungry and ill-clothed. Few men had whole uniforms, and even fewer had shoes. Washington grimly observed that you might have tracked the army from White Marsh to Valley Forge by the blood on their feet. Washington could do little to relieve the suffering of his men. For one thing, the general had only the worthless paper currency of the Continental Congress to buy supplies. Farmers and merchants found it far more profitable to sell their goods to the British in Philadelphia, who paid in gold and silver. Despite the hardships, Washington's men endured surprisingly well. Some even joked about their ragged condition. Drill and discipline. In February of 1778, Baron Friedrich von Steuben came to Valley Forge in a splendid German uniform to serve as a drill master for the Continental Army. Von Steuben did not know English, but he knew how to train men and how to instill pride and discipline. By memorizing a few English phrases, the German was able to drill the American forces. He taught them to march properly, showed them how to maneuver in battle. Building on the experience that the Patriots had gained in past battles, von Steuben transformed the disorganized horde that had fled from New York into a reasonably efficient fighting force. When spring brought news of the French alliance, Washington looked at his newly drilled men and decided the time had come to strike a major blow to the British. Battle of Monmouth. When the French entered the war, the British decided to adjust their strategy. First, they would focus more attention on the southern colonies, where more loyalists live, and second, they would withdraw from Philadelphia to New York. When the British left Philadelphia in June of 1778, Americans attacked them at Monmouth Courthouse in New Jersey. The Battle of Monmouth vindicated von Steuben's work. Despite the early disorder, the Americans quickly and professionally took their places in battle lines. Although the battle was a draw, it showed how much Washington's army had improved since the disasters earlier in the war. The British withdrew to New York. The War in the West. While George Washington was trying to build an army that could fight the British regulars, a different kind of war was taking place on the frontier of the Ohio River. There, the fighting resembled the guerrilla tactics of the French and Indian War. A group of British soldiers and fierce Indian tribes engaged in a brutal struggle with hardy but scattered American frontiersmen. One American leader arose out of the war in the West, George Rogers Clark. Clark, a native Virginian, had come to the Ohio River Valley in 1772 as a resident of Kentucky. Clark recognized the threat that the frontier faced from the British and the Indians. In 1778, the 25-year-old Clark won Virginia's approval to lead an attack on British trading posts north of the Ohio River in the region then known as Northwest. With a tiny force of approximately 175 men, Clark sailed down the Ohio River to what is now Illinois. From there, Clark marched his men overland to the Mississippi River town of Kaskaskia, the town populated mostly by French settlers who did not care for the British anyway. Happily surrendered, several other trading posts quickly fell, including the most important, Vincennes on the Wabash River, what is now Indiana. Later, the British captured Vincennes in February of 1779. Clark marched a small force, some 150 miles, through icy rivers and flooded prairies to face the British there. He retook Vincennes. Clark's victories in the Northwest were not as significant as the battles in the East in terms of numbers, but they had great strategic importance. Clark's expedition reduced Indian attacks, and his presence helped the United States lay claim to the territory north of the Ohio River. Much of the credit for securing Kentucky and the Northwest belongs to him. Number 4. The War in the South. During the early years of war, the Southern colonies poured men and supplies into the military and political ranks of the Patriot cause. But the British largely ignored the region in favor of fighting Washington's Continentals and isolating New England. In 1776, they had tried to quell the rebellion in the South, beginning with a naval attack at Charleston, South Carolina. They made no further attempts until 1778 after the British defeated at Saratoga. In late 1778, the British attacked Georgia and began a drive through the South. They hoped that the presence of His Majesty's troops would awaken loyalist sentiment in the back country, softening opposition, and sever the South from the rest of the country. The plan worked so well at first that British commanders failed to see its flaws. The Southern campaign would be British SLAS, the British advance in Charleston. By early 1779, all of Georgia, including Savannah, its chief city and port, had fallen into British hands. Georgia became a staging area for the more important siege of Charleston. South Carolina, if the British could conquer Charleston, they would not only capture one of the most populated, important cities of America, but also gain access to the Carolina heartland through the navigable rivers that the city defended. In late March 1780, British forces sieged Charleston. Most of the Continental forces in the South, an army of about 5,000, occupied the city. The American commander, General Benjamin Lincoln, heeded the pleadings of Charlestonians to hold the city at all cost. Considering the Americans were outnumbered more than 2 to 1, and their supply lines cut by the British cavalry, the outcome was not surprising. On May 12, 1780, Lincoln surrendered his entire army to the British. It was America's worst defeat of the war. With the fall of Charleston, the Carolinas lay invitingly open to the British. General Charles Cornwallis now commanded the British troops that were marching through the South Carolina Low Country. In August 1780, he defeated Patriot forces in Camden, South Carolina. After the double disasters at Charleston and Camden, the Patriot cause looked grim. Swamp surprises. One small band of South Carolinians kept the war alive in the British-occupied Low Country of South Carolina. The group was distinguished by small black leather caps and the wretchedness of their attire. Their number did not exceed 20 men and boys, some white, some black, and all mounted, but most of them miserably equipped. The leader of this motley assortment of guerrillas was the elusive General Francis Marion, who soon earned the nickname Swamp Fox. Marion and his men would slip out of the swamps and sand flats to attack British outposts and supply lines. Such small guerrilla bands, of course, could not beat the British army in open battle. Their strategic importance lay in pressuring the enemy. Marion's successful hit-and-run operations pinned down British troops, kept them from joining the main British force, and forced Cornwallis to keep looking over his shoulder. One British commander declared that the devil himself could not catch Marion. Kings Mountain. A surprising turn of events occurred in October 1780 that gave patriots cause for encouragement. Cornwallis sent Major Patrick Ferguson to lead an all-Tory detachment of more than 1,000 men into western foothills of South Carolina. Ferguson warned the over-mountain men in the back-country settlements of the western Carolinas and in what is now Tennessee that unless they pledged their loyalty to George III, he would lay waste to their fields, burn their homes, and hang their leaders. Unfortunately for Ferguson, these frontier men did not respond well to threats. A buck-skinned force of 900 men, nearly half of whom were from Tennessee, caught Ferguson and his Tories on the wooded slopes of Kings Mountain. There on the border of North and South Carolina, they killed Ferguson. Almost his entire army was killed, wounded, or captured. The victory at the Battle of Kings Mountain strengthened Patriot resolve. Nathanael Greene. Towards the end of 1780, Congress appointed a new commander for the region. On Washington's advice, they sent the fighting Quaker from Rhode Island, General Nathanael Greene. Greene took a small, threadbare, penniless, demoralized army, and by courage, resourcefulness, and military genius, made it the terror of Cornwallis's army. Greene's first move was to divide his outnumbered army and send a detachment south under General Daniel Morgan. Morgan left with 600 Continentals, hoping that Cornwallis would also divide his force and pursue him. Cornwallis sent Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton and his Tory legion to catch the Continentals. The Americans hated Tarleton for his reputation of killing his prisoners after they had surrendered. Tarleton, however, would more than meet his match in Daniel Morgan. On the rolling meadows of South Carolina, in a place known as Cowpens, the two armies clashed. On January 17, 1781, Morgan displayed his exceptional military skill. In less than an hour, the battle was over. The British suffered over 900 casualties. The Americans had fewer than 100. The Battle of Cowpens was the first major step towards eventual British defeat. After the unsettling loss at Kings Mountain and Cowpens, Cornwallis determined to crush Greene. He and his troops were the only serious obstacle to a conclusive conquest of the Carolinas. In mid-March 1781, the American army faced Cornwallis at a little crossroads in North Carolina called Guilford Courthouse. The British won a victory, but Cornwallis lost one-fourth of his men there. After exhausting battles in the Carolinas, Cornwallis decided to march north to Virginia, where he was joined by reinforcements. He established his headquarters at a port on Virginia's York River, which was only a few miles from Jamestown, the site of the first permanent English settlement in 1607. Little did he realize that this port, Yorktown, would be the scene of a humiliating defeat. By late summer 1781, Cornwallis had amassed a force of 7,200 troops. The Marquis de Lafayette, commanding the outnumbered Continental forces in Virginia, watched with alarm. Although he shouldered the burden of leadership well, the young Lafayette confided in a letter at the time, "When one in 23 has an army to command and Lord Cornwallis to oppose, the time that is left is none too long for sleep." At the end of August, the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse sailed up the Chesapeake Bay, landed 3,000 French troops to join Lafayette and defeat the British fleet. Suddenly, Cornwallis found himself in trouble. Not only was he cut off by sea, but also the arrival of Washington's Continentals and a large force of French regulars meant that he was outnumbered and surrounded. Washington had been leaking false reports that said he planned to attack the British in New York, but instead he was marching to Yorktown. Admiral de Grasse's victory had been an unexpected bonus for Washington, who now caught the ill-fated Cornwallis in a trap. About 17,000 French and American troops surrounded the British and bombarded them day and night. After desperate attempts to break the siege, Cornwallis yielded to the inevitable, asking for terms of surrender on October 17, 1781. 2 days later, 7,000 British soldiers marched between two half-mile lines of American and French troops to lay down their arms. Cornwallis was not present. He claimed he was sick. One of his subordinates carried the general's sword to the French commander, General Rochambeau. The French general shook his head and pointed him to Washington, who understood the insult of Cornwallis's absence and directed that the sword be given to General Benjamin Lincoln, Washington's subordinate. George III was shaken by the loss at Yorktown. The king initially commanded that the war should continue, but soon he submitted to pressure from Parliament and the people to accept that the war was over. Peace commissioners were appointed to meet the American negotiators Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, and John Adams in Paris. The Treaty of Paris was finally signed on September 3, 1783. It acknowledged that the colonies were indeed independent. The United States was awarded all the land east of the Mississippi River, with the exception of Florida, which returned to Spanish control. Yorktown was not an end, however, as much as a beginning. A costly war had secured independence. Now the task of nation-building lay before them. In many ways, the challenges of peace would be greater than the challenges of war. Yet, the generation of Americans who rallied at Lexington, weathered Valley Forge, and besieged the defenses at Yorktown would prove that they could not only win their liberty, but also preserve it.